get started. So I'm Katie Owens. I am the Vice President of Organization for the League of Women Voters, Tyler Smith County. And tonight we are going to be discussing how to vote in Texas. So this is going to be in 3 parts. Our first part is going to cover registering to vote. Our second part will cover preparing to vote. And our third part is going to cover changes to voting laws in Texas that happened this year. So we will just dive right in. I have a PowerPoint presentation prepared, so I'm going to share that screen with you all so that you can view that. Let me get that pulled up for you. All right. So this is our essential conversation about voting. We are doing this in preparation for National Voter Registration Day, which is next week. So if you aren't registered to vote yet, I know a lot of you are dual credit students here for extra credit. So hopefully this will help clarify the process for you all just a little bit. All right. So in the state of Texas, you are eligible to register to vote if you meet the following criteria. You are a United States citizen, you're a resident of the county where you live and where you submit the application. You are at least 17 years and 10 months old. The catch there being you must be 18 by election day. And then you are not a convicted felon. Caveat being you are eligible if you've completed your sentence, probation, and parole, and you have not been declared by a court to be mentally incapacitated. Another thing to note, you must be a resident of your county for at least 30 days in order to register to vote. So those are kind of the guidelines there for voter registration. That is also laid out on votetexas.gov. As well as other websites, but votetexas.gov is the official website from the Secretary of State's office related to voting. All right, in order to register to vote, you must complete your voter registration application. There are 3 ways that you can do this. You can fill out the form online. You'll need to print it, sign it, and then mail it to your county elections office. You can request a printed application. That form is also online. You just fill it out, submit it, and then an application will be mailed to you. And then the last way is to do this in person. So you can visit a local voter registrar to complete the process of registering to vote. They can be found at your county elections office, or you can find a volunteer deputy voter registrar as well, and they can complete that process for you and help you get registered to vote. As I mentioned, next week, September 28th, which is Tuesday, is National Voter Registration Day. And one of our jobs as the League of Women Voters is to assist people with registering to vote. So we try to celebrate this little holiday every year. And I would like to invite the president, one of our co-presidents of our local league, Marilyn Wills, to say a few words about Voter Registration Day. So Marilyn, if you can unmute.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah.
We're excited about National Voter Registration Day because we go to places all over Smith County to engage people in registering, and it's always prior to the November election. And this is something that started in 2012, and it's nationwide. So it's a civic holiday, and businesses, nonprofits, churches, libraries, schools, all of those kinds of organizations gather together and actually do this voter registration drive. And it's just something that's really kind of exciting to see happen every year. So we're coordinating this time with Smith County Elections Office, and they have people going out to UT, TJC, and the downtown square in Tyler. And then as the league, we usually do additional sites, and we're going to be at the public library, the Glass Recreation Center, New Life Community Church, and that's going to be fun because it's going to be a drive-through. So watch our Facebook, and we'll post the times and the locations for all of those. And if anybody's interested in becoming a deputy registrar, it's really simple. You can go down to the registrar's office and become, take their short test and become a deputy registrar, and then you could help us do this. Even as soon as the 28th, you could help. But we always are in need of people to help us with registering voters, because that's one of the biggest things the league does. So that's a little bit about National Voter Registration Day.
Thanks, Marilyn. We appreciate it. All right. Once you have completed your paperwork to register to vote your application, you can check your registration status at votetexas.gov, and that will indicate to you if your application has been received, as well as if your application has been processed. It can take up to 30 days for your application to be processed, so just be aware of that. And a couple of other things to note about registration. If you have moved since the last election, you need to update your voter registration as well. If you moved within the same county, you can change that information easily online at the Texas Secretary of State's website. If you move to a new county, you can re-register by completing the steps mentioned earlier. So you'll need to complete a new voter registration application. And then the last thing that I should mention with registering to vote, if you have to update your driver's license, that's actually the easiest way to register to vote. Because of the National Voter Registration Law or Act of 1993, more commonly known as the Motor Voter Law, you can actually register to vote at DPS when you get your driver's license. You just check a box, and that's all you have to do, register to vote. So that makes things really simple there. Now, we do have an election coming up in November for the constitutional amendments. So the last day to register to vote for that election is going to be Monday, October 4th. So if you would like to vote in that election, make sure you are registered by Monday, October 4th. All right. So that's the process of registering to vote. Our next topic is going to be how to prepare to vote. And I think this is really important to talk about, especially if you've never voted before. It can be a little bit intimidating. Texas typically has really long ballots, and it can be hard to know who to vote for or what ballot provisions you would like to vote for. So you need to do a little research on that. The league prepares for each election a nonpartisan personalized voting information for every voter. And that can be found at vote411.org. You simply type in your address and it will pull up all sorts of information for you, including what's on your ballot, candidate information, polling locations, and other types of information. One neat thing that I utilize in every single election is that you can actually choose on Vote 411 which provisions you are going to vote for, how you're going to vote for those provisions, which candidates you want to vote for. And then at the end, it will compile a list for you. You can print that out and take that with you to the polling location when you're voting. For those of you who have never voted before, we are really relying on cell phones these days, but you can't take your phones out in a polling place. So this is a really easy way to help you remember who you're going to vote for, especially in some of the down ballot races or for some of those ballot provisions that you may just not remember who you're planning to vote for. So this is a great way to keep track of that without violating any state laws there. Another thing to note when you go vote is that you must have an acceptable form of voter identification. There are 7 acceptable forms of ID. They are listed there. Most commonly used is your Texas driver's license. So that will just be swiped at the polling location, and it will pull up your voter information. You can also use an election ID certificate, a personal ID card, or a handgun license issued by the state of Texas, or a military ID card with a photo, a citizenship certificate with a photo, or your US passport. Those are also acceptable forms of identification. If you do not have that acceptable form of identification and cannot obtain it before Election Day, then you may execute a reasonable impediment declaration and provide one of those supporting forms of ID, which could include some sort of government document with your name and address, a current utility bill, a current bank statement, a government check, a paycheck, or your birth certificate or foreign birth document. Those are all acceptable additional forms of identification. All right. Last thing to note is when you can vote. So as I mentioned, there's a constitutional amendment election in November. The election day, first Tuesday following the first Monday in November, which this year is November 2nd. You can vote that day from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. at your local precinct office that is listed on your voter registration certificate. However, I prefer to early vote. That's just my personal preference. And I know many people also prefer to early vote. Usually the lines are shorter and it's a little bit more flexible if you can't go vote on election day. So if you want to early vote, that is going to be open from October 18th to October 29th. And you can vote at any early voting location in your county. That can be found on your county voter registrar's website. In Smith County, you just go to the Smith County Voter Registrar's website and they list those early voting locations for you. All right, so our next section is going to cover changes to Texas voting laws. And so I'd like to introduce for this Dr. Mark Owens from the University of Texas at Tyler. And he's going to talk a little bit about the new voting law that passed here in Texas, which is more commonly known as SB 1. So Dr. Owens, can you give us an overview of that law?
Yeah, so by its title, the law was called, or was described as the Election Integrity Bill. You might have even seen it recently on the news because Governor Abbott came to Tyler to sign that law. So he didn't sign it in Austin. He actually, came to this area. The reason is because the state senator who sponsored it is from East Texas. Now, there are a couple of things that this is going to add to our voting process. Katie's already mentioned the votetexas.gov. There will then be a new sub website to that, which is going to allow you to track the status of your absentee ballot. One of the reasons about this, though, that caught a little bit of controversy was that in order to have that ballot tied to you so that it's your ballot to be tracked, is they will use the last 4 digits or your driver's license number or the last 4 digits of your social security number. So that information is going to have to be provided by anybody who asks for an absentee ballot in order to be able to see the status of that in the future. This bill also takes into account defining the limits of different activities that those county voter registrars and county election officials can do. So the expectation now is that they are there to administer the election, but not necessarily there to advocate how you should vote. So this puts a lot of pressure on the voters to know exactly how they wanted to vote. As Katie had just mentioned, you could say you wanted to vote early, but if you want to vote absentee, you have to ask the election administrator to have that ballot request. They can't just offer it to you, and they certainly can't send it to you without you making that request. Sort of that's by the law now. Overall, right, we did a poll around the state with the Dallas Morning News, and we had found 67% of the state actually supported this one change, which was limiting the hours that the county can be open for its early voting. And this was something that doesn't necessarily affect aspects of Gregg County or Smith County, because we had essentially the same hours opening, but you could vote somewhere between 6 a.m. and now 9 p.m. is the range of the maximum hours for voting. That's more limited than what actually occurred in places like Harris County, or in San Antonio, where they were able to vote throughout the night, especially using the county, their emergency powers during the pandemic. So this was sold for a while as a question that it will actually compel other counties, like in West Texas, to be open to vote longer during early voting. But that wasn't how it was written, right? You have a maximum set of hours that someone could be open, but there's not a minimum set of hours to be told how the county needs to be doing that work. This also, it empowered something for the poll watchers. So partisan poll watchers are going to be something that we've always been able to have in the election offices. You might not have noticed this if you've gone to vote, that there could be someone standing in the corner watching and making sure that all the rules are being followed for their candidates. They're not to speak to the people who are voting, but sometimes you can think of this because there are partitions to make sure that you have security of your ballot, that those poll watchers can't always see what's going on. And so the bill gives them now free range to move around the polling place to make sure that they can see people while they vote. Again, not to speak to them, but if any county official doesn't give them that flexibility, they can then bring a lawsuit against the county, right? And that person who's working for the election becomes criminally liable for that. So that's something that is new to this law. And the other part here is that when I mentioned before, the county cannot actually distribute the application for absentee ballots to you, but the group that can are the political parties and the candidates. They can do that without your request before. So that really presents an option here that I think is sometimes interesting, that, you know, the campaigns are there to actually help you go vote. Now what Texas is sort of creating with this law is that the county is just there to count the ballots and allow candidates and parties to watch them count the ballots.
Thank you for that overview. So what are some of the major changes from the law? How does it compare to previous voting laws that we had?
So one is, I think that in the past, we've had voting laws that were adding requirements that you, the voter, had to follow. This one actually set a lot more requirements of the counties and how they are to do their jobs. So as I mentioned before, there are questions about the hours, but it does set for this. If you were to be an absentee voter, there's one specific requirement that's now is there. You cannot return your absentee ballot in any envelope you choose. So now the county will be sending you two pieces of information: your ballot to fill out as an absentee ballot, and also the envelope that is official for that, because it's going to have, right, the documentation for you. It's going to have your signature sealing that it's yours. This law says that for your absentee ballot to count, it must be returned in that envelope. And so that really means that you have to be in charge of two different pieces. It also changes this for your voter, or for the voters, because they will check our signatures. And the signatures now on those ballots will be counted towards any signature that the state has of you. That's the signature on your driver's license, right? Thinking in this, how close is your signature now to when you signed it when you were 16? Versus the other question, right? How close is it to when you last filed any other paperwork with the state? There's also going to be a real change here called temporary voting locations. And this is again towards the county will sort of have to deal with this. But when they set up tents to let people vote elsewhere, now those tents have to be tied or connected directly adjacent to a building. And so maybe you've seen this before, but back in 2018, there used to be these temporary voting locations outside of high school football games. I've seen it in White House. They had a school bond going, and during the JV football game, parents were able to go down and vote right in between the stadium sections. But now that would not be in the stadium adjacent to an actual building, right? They have to move the voting now closer to where the bathrooms are, right? Or anything there that really sets a limit. Instead of just putting in a wide open space, it now needs to be by the building.
All right. So how do these changes really affect voters? It sounds like most of these changes are affecting counties, not necessarily the individual voter. So what are some of the impacts for us when we go vote?
Yeah, I think that one is just to know for the voters that a lot of ways, if you're going to vote early, you still can follow. Nothing has changed with what Katie had presented to you. It's still knowing you have the ability to have the flexibility to take your affidavit, right? That you don't have the identification, you vote in person, and just make sure that you know you have the right not to be interacting with the partisan poll watchers, right? This still maintains that the individuals from the campaigns who are there, if they're going to campaign and ask you to vote or wear a t-shirt for their candidate, they have to be outside the polling location by more than 10 feet. But yeah, for us, mostly it's absentee ballots and voters are going to be affected the most. They have to return that ballot by mail. They have to return that ballot in its envelope. And unless you drop it off directly at the county courthouse.
So why is this bill so controversial? I know I've seen a lot of different articles discussing this bill and the impact this bill is going to have on national media sources, or from national media sources rather. So it's getting a lot of attention nationwide. So why is that?
Yeah, one of the big concerns right now is, is this creating an additional burden for Texans to vote? And as kind of what Katie was mentioning earlier on the who's affected, it might not be Gregg and Smith County. It is going to be the lawsuits that have already been filed are from Bexar County and San Antonio and Harris County and Houston. There, this law restricts the hours that they previously had used to vote because it's hard to get 4 million people to go vote, all within the same time frame that we can vote here in East Texas. And so from that perspective, they see that as a limitation from the past, right? The status quo is allowing you to potentially drop off that ballot in a drop box. Additionally, now, there is one aspect which was controversial is if you go vote, or I'd say right now you have a family member, a friend who has a disability and needs physical assistance by you to help them vote, the county now has to document your name and what relationship you have to that person. So that does bring into some question, you just mean to be there to help. Why does the county need to record your relationship with someone? I will think that overall the national news sources related to this law have been focused on some of the questions of this being controversial because the bill was more controversial when it was introduced than it is when it was signed into law. So the reason why the Texas Democrats left the state and others was they were seeking some amendments that existed where when this bill was introduced, you were going to have a letter from your doctor in order to get an absentee ballot. And that was removed through amendments. And they were going to limit the hours of voting on Sundays. And that was removed in the conference by the Texas Senate and the Texas House. So some of those limitations were there, showing that the Texas Senate, as it was originally drafted, wanted to have a more conservative bill. But as it stands, this bill is mostly tied to and going to be different for how counties handle their votes. But it still is controversial. There's going to be a budget line on this. Know that not only we're talking about letting people have transparency to see how they count the ballots. The County of Dallas has already talked about it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy new video equipment in order to show and record this to people for transparency. Because even if you can't be there to watch the ballot count, your political party can still request the ability to see that. And so the county now has to record it. And the other interesting part of this that's going to change is that we will now see more transparency in how people voted based on the ballot type that they shared. So you'll see if early voters really did vote more for a Democratic candidate or Republican candidate, and you're going to see all of that same vote share for your governor candidates based off of the absentee ballots. So people will track and understand more now how people vote and if that's a difference in kind of their choices.
Interesting. Do you have anything else you would like to add about this voting law?
Yeah, I think it is interesting when we think of this, that overall the public was split. I mean, when I say there's a majority support for this, only 52% supported the option of giving the partisan poll watchers more access because it's a question where normally we would have trusted the government to do this work. Now we're extending and sort of empowering political parties to do the work that county governments traditionally have. On the idea of limiting the hours of voting, and also the drop boxes, only 45% of the state supported this question about the early voting, and 38% opposed it. So there really was no majority on that question. A lot of people weren't sure because it wasn't going to affect their county. But these are a couple of the things that it's worth pointing out, again, for us to remember that a lot of these processes of Texas voting are going to stay the same. I think it's good to always remember to check the Vote 411 that the League of Women Voters puts out, because it'll tell you how you can vote in your county. The county election officials are going to also point out and tell you all the locations that we can vote in. And so related to Rusk County or Gregg County and Smith County, we even have the things called vote centers. They'll tell you which ones are open, which ones are closed, and how you have the flexibility to go vote on each of these days.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Dr. Owens. So I'd now like to open it up to you all for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay. What happened?
No.
Okay. So if you all have questions, unmute and feel free to ask those right now.
Katie, this is Marilyn. I wonder if you would address, if I'm a student and I live in a different county, but I go to school somewhere else, where should I make my vote?
So it depends on where you are registered to vote, and you have the flexibility here in Texas to register either in your home county where you live, where your parents reside or whatever, or to register to vote at school. So if you go away to school, you can also register to vote there. There is that flexibility as well. That's just personal preference, whatever you choose to do there. Uh-oh, did we lose it?
What if you go to school in a different state compared to where you live? Does it work the same way?
You would have to check that state's voting laws rather than Texas's, but I would, I would guess that you could potentially register to vote there. You might have to change your residency.
Yes, I think that would come. It is state by state. I remember in Maine, there were college students that were from Massachusetts that were able to vote in a Maine election. And so that was because they were able to show that point of residency. And then the state would also tell your home state that you're not eligible to vote there. But I think in those cases, the Secretary of State will know most of that. And it is come back to your, I think a lot of ways, yeah, that residency question that Katie was mentioning.
Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Did you say that it was 67% of the state that voted to have longer term or shorter term?
Well, 67% of the state supported this limit of the time, and that was on a poll that they would have. Now what we can do is we can vote from between 6 a.m. or 9 p.m. on the early voting, and only on 6 hours on Sunday before that election, last Sunday.
You said that if there's a whole bunch of partisan, I don't really know what to call them, but people with pins and shirts and all that, and they're set up outside the building, you can just ignore them?
Yes. Yeah. They're just there trying to promote their candidate. So they can they can be ignored. You don't have to stop and talk to them. As well as the partisan poll watchers, you don't have to talk to them inside the polling locations either.
Yeah, I mean, the flexibility that they're being granted right now is the ability to just observe what's going on silently. And then they would only address their questions to the person who's the election judge of the precinct. So that would be not to talk to the voters.
Any other questions, y'all? Our cameras, I don't know if
Yeah.
y'all can see us, but we can't see you.
It's good, we can hear you, so
Yeah.
just raise your hand or ask the question.
We can see you.
Okay.
Good.
Do those like poll booths have to be 10 feet away as well, or is it just when people are working like the polling like area that they have to be 10 feet away to give their
So one of the things that's good right now, I think in this case of the ballots is, you get your ballot and you're in a secure booth, like you were mentioning. No one will see you cast that ballot, but after you take it and have it go to the counter, then essentially the poll watcher will be able to move around the walls of this room so that they could see and make sure that no one has changed the way you're voting, or there wasn't a problem in getting your ballot through the scanner. I think a lot of this though is actually meaning towards at the end of the night when they count the ballots. This is the other part where people definitely have watchers, is making sure that they see someone while they're counting the ballots. And this was where I actually mentioned in the absentee ballots, the question about whether or not the ballot was returned in the correct format. And there, I think a partisan poll watcher would be able to say this follows the normal law or this doesn't, right? So they're going to try and make the argument that this incorrect ballot needs to go before the board, who makes determinations about provisional ballots or other groups like that. And so a lot of this is the checking of signatures and groups, right? So if anyone, and I think that's why they were focused in on those who might be helping someone vote if they were disabled. The real concern sometimes that Texas Republicans have mentioned was, what about bringing people to the polls in an entire van, right? And so are those people coming, right, because the person's driving the van to help them and they have requested them, or have they picked them up and then now they're voting, they're driving them to go vote for a particular candidate? And those aren't really things that are new. That's occurred for decades in elections. It's usually can occur in ways that are very helpful and not aspects that are going to promote fraud, right? It's just people need rides to the polls and someone can do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're referring to counting the ballots in your statements here. Most of our ballots now are cast through digital. Whenever we go to the election box to vote, the ballots that you're talking about counting are more of the mail-in type ballots that we had a group of individuals, being the Republican Women's Party and the Democratic Women's Party here in Russ County, Texas, that were taking groups of these ballots to nursing homes, places where people were disabled, unable to vote, but they did not necessarily request the ballots. But we had a group of ladies that were willing to carry the ballots to let these people vote if they so choose to. Have they changed it now to where you cannot take these ballots to these places, but these people at the nursing homes or other disabled facilities actually have to request the right to have a ballot to vote?
That's a good question. So that is where the law right now had a new addition, is that the political parties are able to do that. Just the same way you described it. They can bring the applications to the voters without them having made that request. The only group that cannot do that is the county election official or a state employee, right? They're not, the people who work for the state are not able to give you an absentee ballot form unless you ask for them to do so. So if you make
Correct.
that request, they can absolutely deliver it, but they can't deliver it on demand.
Okay, I guess I'm missing part of what you're trying to say here. What I'm saying is they were just, people were not requesting the forms that were being taken to the facilities. They were just being taken, the blank forms, to the facilities and basically sitting up front saying, we're here with these ballots. If you'd like to vote, you're welcome to. What did they put in place to verify that what say Granny Willis voted, that what she actually voted was her vote, not what the political party, be it the Republican, Independents, or the Democratic Party, handed them their ballot? What did they put in place or change to verify that Granny Williams is the one that actually filled this out and said, this is the way I would like to vote?
So that's part of the oath that's sort of signed in the signature of the envelope. That's there. That's the closest that they can do. I think what does occur in this that helps is the aspect of now having to put that voter's driver's license or part of their social security number on the absentee ballot, so they can track if an absentee ballot has been made and request, in this case, where it is in the process of going towards counting.
Yeah, so it's adding those 2 additional checks, either the driver's license number or the social security number, and then signing the envelope when you seal it to make sure, and they do a signature verification there, which of course is not 100% foolproof, but it is, I guess, about as close as you can get.
Yeah. And the one part I wanted to just mention was that you're part of saying that the women's clubs for each party still have the ability to host those tables anywhere that they'd like, right? As members of the political parties and on behalf of the candidates.
Yeah. All right. Do we have any other questions? Those are great questions, y'all. Really. All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, we'll wrap it up. Again, I'm Katie Owens. I'm the VP of Organization for the League of Women Voters, Tyler Smith County. I also teach at Kilgore College. So if you're a KC student and you think of a question later, you can reach out to me via email. My email is kowens@kilgore.edu. Or if you're one of my students and you think of a question, just shoot me a message on Remind and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. But we appreciate everyone for attending. Again, if you're one of Mr. Ralston's students, shoot me a message so that I can make sure that I get your attendance verified for him so that you can get your extra credit. But we thank you all for attending. This was really a good conversation. And we hope you all go vote in every upcoming election. So we'll see you soon. Bye.
Can I ask one more question about
Oh,
how
yeah.
to message you for the